Welcome to the Sales History Podcast with your host, author of The Transparency Sale and the Transparent Sales Leader, Todd Caponi. Each episode brings you the incredible and sometimes strange minds, philosophies, and approaches from sales history's past with relevance to today. Here's Todd.
Are you familiar with the concept of an AMA or an Ask Me Anything? Where essentially there's an expert that hosts an interactive session where individuals can come and ask them any questions that they want. Now, this seems to be a trend. I see it a lot on LinkedIn Live, Facebook Live, Instagram, stories, like all of those types of places. But have you ever wondered, what does an AMA look like 112 years ago? No? Well, I have. And so the subject of today's episode is, I want to look into the past and go, all right, you've got salespeople that got questions. There's experts out there. Where would they go to answer their questions? And for the most part, in 1906, they were going to Salesmanship Magazine. Salesmanship Magazine, which is a popular magazine from around 1905 to 1908, 1909, before it merged with Arthur Sheldon's The Business Philosopher magazine. They had a section in every month's edition called Send In Your Queries. And these queries were questions that were asked from field sales reps out around the country and probably around the world. And Salesmanship Magazine had access to 62 salespeople, sales experts, sales managers that were at the ready based on the question that would come in to answer them. And I thought it might be fun to get a view of what kinds of questions were salespeople asking in 1906. And what's amazing is the answers are so current. Like when I look at the answers of these, I'm like, you know what? If that question was asked of me today, that would be the exact answer I would give. So what I want to do today is we're going to pick a few of my favorite questions from 1906's Send In Your Queries and share some of the answers that we're giving from these experts. So buckle up, because this one's going to be fun. All right, so let's start with question number one. Question number one is from somebody whose initials are BBD. Like, I don't know if that's like Belle Biv DeVoe for any of you that were around in the 80s and 90s. Probably not. But again, this is 1906. This individual asks this question. He says, the peculiar conditions under which I have made a recent sale have put me at variance with my manager, and I should like your advice. And so for you listening, I'm going to walk you through these peculiar conditions, and I want you to think, do I side with the salesperson or do I side with the sales manager? Here it is. He talks about this idea that he went and called on a large company that was a target for him in a city. And as he got there, it turns out that the individual who runs it that he's trying to call on is just leaving his office on a 2-day pleasure trip. So a 2-day vacation. And this individual rep, BBD, says it was impossible for me to interview him. Here's where it gets crazy. This rep decides to essentially follow him to the train station, gets on the train, and sits across from him in the smoking department of the train and starts talking to him. And so it was a 3-hour trip. And he says, before our 3 hours trip was ended, I had accepted his invitation to make one of his pleasure party. So this rep follows this guy and decides to basically go on vacation with him. How crazy is that? Now, remember, these reps, they're traveling already, right? They're out on the road for 4 or 5 days a week. He decides, I'm just going to go with. Now, what ends up happening is this rep says, I spent a couple of days with the crowd. So this individual, he's with a group on this vacation. The rep ends up interacting with them. He says, I made a fast friend with this buyer and spent $200 of the firm's money in keeping up my end of the general hospitality. Now, $200 in 1906, that's a pretty healthy sum today. Like, that's probably a couple of grand. Now, he says, I closed him for a large order immediately upon our return and have presumably made him a permanent customer of ours. Now, here's the peculiar conditions, right? The rep says, my manager congratulated me on the sale until he learned of the 2 days spent on the pleasure trip and saw the $200 item in my expense account. He sent me a severe letter about attending to business and declines to stand for the $200 expense. Is this treating me fairly? So that's the question to you. Do you side with the sales rep who decided to go over and above to pursue this contact, sat with him on a train on his vacation, ended up becoming friends with him to the point where he hung out with the whole crew, and upon returning, he got the big sale, which he assumes will continue over and over again to be an upsell, cross-sell opportunity? Or do you side with the manager that's like, what did you do? You need to be attending to your business, and I'm not paying for this. Well, let's take a look at what the expert has to say. So the expert initials are HHA, and I'm not sure why they didn't put the expert's name in here, but there is a couple of points that this individual makes that I think are worth exploring. And so this individual expert sides with the manager, and I think I do too, but I would love your thoughts on it. He says first that if this individual really is the head of a large company, he's probably smart enough to have taken your meeting if what you're representing is really valuable, whether or not you went on vacation with him or not, right? Like you should have not gone and come back in a couple of days when he's back. So that's answer number one. But answer number two from this expert says, quote, "It is well to remember that the man who gives you an order solely because you have, quote, shown yourself a good fellow is very likely to switch about and give the next order to your competitor for a similar reason." Good point there, right? And the last point that this expert makes, so number three is, quote, "If you had spent the 2 days of his absence in calling on other customers and on his return had depended on your selling powers to get an entrance and close the sale, you would have taken less risk of losing the order. You would have conserved your firm's time and money and shown yourself fully as enterprising." So it's a good point, right? What happens if you would have gone on this vacation with this individual, rung up all of the expenses and not gotten the sale? That would have even been worse. Would he still try to expense it? The fact that he got the sale is probably a risky proposition. You probably could have gotten the meeting anyway if this person's really smart. Number two, is this deal going to be fleeting because it's based on a relationship? And number three is you should have spent that extra time going out and prospecting for other business and then come back around. So that was question number one. Let's keep going on to question number two. Okay, for question number two, let's tackle a prospecting one. I also want to do a job search one and a transparency one. So we're going to try to get through 4 today. There's so many though, and they're all amazing to me. But here's a question that comes in again in 1906. Individual is asking the experts, "Hey, listen, quote, I find a great deal of difficulty in getting a hearing from busy men. And when I do get a hearing, it is often hard for me to decide just how to present my proposition to suit the individual case." This guy goes on to say, like, "I grope around in my selling talk rather nervously, sometimes for a good opening remark. Is there any way to overcome this difficulty?" Now, look around at the AMAs today, especially the prospecting one, is pretty common. And the answer that this expert gives, I think, is spot on, and it really combines 2 elements. Number 1 is confidence, and number 2 is empathy, right? And so here's what this individual does and goes through in the answer to this individual that's having some struggle with their ability to get in, and once they get in, how do they actually kick off the talk? The expert digs in to say, first of all, regarding confidence, like have enough pride in your proposition to feel that it is important not only to yourself, but to your prospect, right? Like that's where it starts. It's confidence. That if you're able to walk in and go, "Hey, listen, this is something you got to hear about," you can depend that he will not think it is worthwhile taking up if you cannot make him feel from your manner that it is worthwhile talking about. So it starts with confidence in what you're selling. Now he goes on to talk about that opening remark, right? And part of it comes from that lack of confidence. This expert says, "The difficulty in finding an opening remark arises from lack of confidence. You will quit floundering around as soon as you are sufficiently confident about your proposition to adopt your talk concerning it to any man's requirements." So it starts there, and then the expert ends with this little piece of empathy. And this empathy is, before you call on a man, study out just what your proposition will do for him. Begin by stating the fact that you would think would interest you most in that proposition if you were in his place, right? So empathy, confidence and empathy. So great one. That was number 2 from a prospecting perspective. Let's go on to number 3, and let's talk about your job search. All right. A lot of people are dealing with that right now. This is a really interesting one, and I think it was pretty timely. The answer, though, it's going to be pretty clear. It came from 1906. Initials MIJ reaches out saying, I'm an all-around man who has recently come to Chicago. I've had considerable experience in specialty selling, canvassing for books, nurseries. While I now have fairly good position in an office, and here's the part that might sound timely to many of you, yet I feel that there is not much future where I am. Though I've always had good success selling, I feel hampered in applying for positions because I do not know the lines or the trade. Please tell me how to get a positioning as a traveling salesman carrying a standard line, as I do not know how to go to work to get it, being without acquaintances or influence in the city. All right, so that's an interesting one. Newtown only knows a couple of lines, is worried about applying for jobs where he probably doesn't check all the boxes in terms of requirements. I think this is kind of cool. The expert that replies has got basically 3 methods. Number 1 is he starts by explaining that, hey, listen, if you've got good success in canvassing, which is the term that they used for prospecting back then, you're not going to have any trouble getting a job in any, with any progressive sales manager in a city like Chicago. Goes on to say, what will make up for your inexperience in this particular line is the fact that the leading organizations have excellent methods for training their recruits, right? So sound familiar? Let's hope so. He then goes on to talk about the 3 ways to go about this. Number 1, personal letters to sales managers in the line that you wish to enter. So go do your homework, be a canvasser, prospect, and send a note that really encompasses your expertise. And it's about, this individual says it's by far the best way. Spend a day or 2 working out a careful letter, stating your qualities, naming carefully the firms for which you have worked and the amount of business you have done for them, and make a request for employment with the man whom you address. You will be surprised at the number of satisfactory replies you receive. So that was number 1. Now, number 2, this sounds like 1906, right? Put advertisements in the local city newspapers. So you put in an ad in one or more of the Sunday papers of the city. And it says, do not scrimp in information of yourself in the ad. Make it definite. Work hard to make your advertisement stand out from the rest. You will get replies, which should be handled the same as the answers to your personal letters to the sales managers mentioned above, right? So put an ad in the newspaper. Hey, I'm here. I've got this expertise. Like, that's an interesting way to do it. The third way is of answering an ad. And this individual says this one generally gets you nowhere, but the first 2 are the most powerful ways to do it. I just thought it was kind of a funny end here where he wraps up by saying, when you answer an advertisement, you are in the position of asking a favor. When a sales manager answers your advertisement or your letter, he is asking the favor of you, and you have just that much advantage. So, interesting way to put it, but you know what? Why not? Send letters, prospect for the jobs that you want. That's a pretty interesting way. I don't see too many people putting advertisements in the newspaper today, but you never know. All right, last question, and I would be remiss if it wasn't to do with transparency. So let's go to it. As you probably recall, my favorite sales quote of all time is from Arthur Dunn from 1918. And he says, if the truth won't sell it, don't sell it. Well, I think that's very appropriate given this last question that we're going to tackle today. And it comes from an individual. His initials are MBL. And he's talking about the farm implements that he sells. So he's out on the road and he's selling farm tools. And he says that Listen, our literature issued by the sales department represents that all of the implements we carry are perfect in every particular, and I sell the goods on this representation. Later, it develops that an implement is weak in some one point and gives dissatisfaction. At settlement time, the only way to get more business from the dealer, if at all, is by adjusting the loss as seems best in one's judgment and promising a higher grade of output in the future. When I get the second order on this promise, I take the matter up with my sales manager, who admits the fault in the implement and assures me that the necessary improvements will be made in next season's goods, urging me to go ahead and get business on this understanding. But because the factory is pushed with orders, so there's a lot of demand, no improvement is being made. The company decides that it is less expensive to make a few repairs for free, he writes gratis, than to make a change in construction. So that sounds like messaging and positioning or the product itself. In this, I think the company overlooks the effect of such policy on its own reputation and on that of its goods. What do you do, right? The answer is transparency, and this expert nails it. And he answers by talking about 3 really paths to take. Number 1 is, if you are convinced that the company is deliberately misrepresenting its goods, quit the company. Right back to Arthur Dunn's quote. If the truth won't sell it, don't sell it. He goes on to say that it is easier to get a new place than to get back one's self-esteem and reputation once they have been forfeited through a crooked deal. He then goes on to talk about the 2 paths that you should take if you are going to stay. Path number 1 is, if you stay with the firm, represent the goods to the dealer exactly as they are, emphasizing what good points they really have and making up for the possible deficiencies by promising gratis repairs. So that's number 1, is go in and say, hey, this is what's great. We've had some issues here, and if that happens, we'll come right back out and fix it for free. Or number 2 is, they call it booming the goods, which from reading between the lines, it essentially means warrantying them. That just says that, we're going to boom the goods according to the promises of improvement which your firm has given, and take your dealer's order conditionally. The condition being that they give satisfaction, meaning essentially a money-back guarantee. If the company is going to say they're going to fix it, they better, and they're asking you to represent it that way, go out and do it that way, right? You should have an explicit understanding with your manager to the effect that you will practice either or both of these methods in keeping your trade. So, question number 1 was kind of crazy, right? This expense report one, but we've talked a little bit about prospecting, we've talked a little bit about job searching, and we've talked about messaging and positioning through transparency. There are so many more, and it's so fun to dig into this stuff. But what do you think? Are the answers that these experts are giving back then right on? But even more importantly, you can probably see how the questions haven't really changed in 112 years, have they? These were from 1906. As always, let me know what you think, right? I have so much fun sharing this stuff. And if there's other subjects that you like to see or visit, please reach out. The reviews that you are leaving are awesome. Like, they literally inspire me to keep going with this. But subscribe, reach out, tell your friends, because again, I love spreading the good news of some of the experts and the big brains and some of the lessons learned from sales histories past, and hopefully with a spin where you can take pieces of it and apply it here to the future. So stay tuned for the next episode, and thanks again for listening.